This week on Business Mike, the business of literature. My guests today are Kudakwashe Kamupira and Barbara Njau. They are the co-founders of Bahati Books, an e-publishing company that aims to bring global readers captivating and well-written African literature by African authors. In today's show, we discuss the role of Bahati Books in helping African authors publish their books. We also discuss a few business tips like why it's important to have an alternative source of income as you build your business, and we discuss which African books deserve to be turned into movies. All this and more next on Business Mike.
You're listening to the Business Mike podcast, amazing interviews with inspiring entrepreneurs. For more amazing interviews, go to www.businessmike.com or download our podcast every Monday from Pod Africa.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Business Mike. My name is Daudi Mugabi and joining me today is Barbara and Kudakwashe. Ladies, welcome to the show. Can you just let the listeners know a little bit about yourself and what you do?
My name is Barbara.
And my name is Kudakwashe.
And we run Bahati Books. So Bahati Books is a digital publishing company which focuses exclusively on publishing African literature. And more specifically, it's young adult fiction.
Right. And what were you doing before you started Bahati Books? And what was it that made you start this business in the first place?
Okay, so before I started Bahati Books, I actually worked within the legal field. I basically worked within residential and commercial conveyancing. And I did this for about 4 years. And Barbara, do you want to say what you were doing?
Yeah, so I used to work as a journalist for a similar period before we started Bahati Books.
Yeah, and so literally the reason why we actually started Bahati Books was really it stemmed out of frustration. So I actually got into African literature when I was sort of like in my early 20s. I've always been a very avid reader. So ever since I was a child, I was always reading some sort of book. I remember I used to read a lot of Enid Blyton, and then I sort of like moved into reading books like by authors like Danielle Steele, John Grisham. But essentially it was only when it was just after university, and I literally stumbled upon a book by Tsitsi Dangarembwa. It's called Nervous Conditions, and I'm originally from Zimbabwe, and it was the first time that I'd actually read any book written by an author of Zimbabwean origin to start with. But secondly, it was the first time I'd actually read a book where I could actually connect with the characters that were in the book, because most of the books that I essentially read growing up, I could never really identify myself with any of the experiences of the characters. And what you tend to find is, I think for a lot of people, when you haven't really read anything where you're able to sort of like find yourself in the book, you tend to almost like start imagining things and living in a world where you think that's the world that's actually out there. But in actual fact, you share none of the experiences of the characters. And so it was from this that I was really excited, and I started downloading more and more books and buying more books as well. But what I found was that the more books I downloaded, you know, for me, it was a case of I almost like hit a wall when it came to the authors. So if it wasn't sort of like the best-selling authors like Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, Wole Soyinka, or Chinua Achebe, I literally couldn't find any other authors beyond this. And for me, I found it quite frustrating. So in terms of finding out about other authors that are out there, I would literally have to be asking other friends like Barbara herself, who I knew were into African literature, so that I could find out other titles that were out there, because I struggled to get any titles really from any new authors other than those of bestsellers, really.
Yeah, so I encountered quite a similar experience, and hence why we thought, instead of, you know, having this difficulty and all of these kind of your book recommendations relying on your network, we decided to kind of create Bahati Books as this portal, or rather marketplace, where people who are looking for different types of African literature could find that content.
Right. And I'll share with you a challenge that I had recently. I've been planning on writing a children's book. So I wanted it to be African based. So when I went online, try and find similar children's books that were done by Africans, I really struggled. I couldn't find anything. And the closest thing that I could get was, because of the keyword children in Africa, I would get stories or books on war and NGOs and stuff like that. And it's not really what I was looking for.
Yeah. And that's constantly the challenge that I suppose most readers face. And so that's part of our focus. So changing that and widening what it means to have African books and African fiction, because it doesn't, even people when they look for adult fiction, if they put African literature and stories, there's still similar search results like war, blood diamonds, and so on.
Most of the titles as well, beyond sort of like even finding the stories on war and blood diamonds, I think another frustrating thing is, which you've already mentioned, is that the books that are written are not necessarily even written by Africans themselves. Yeah. So you find that even the books that you do find that are there about Africa, they're usually written by foreign people. And so it makes you then start to sort of like question, the authenticity, I suppose, of the voice that is within the book itself, because you sort of like think, okay, are you talking from your experience of actually being there, or are you talking about things that you simply found out from your travels when you went there, for a few months, and then you've sort of like come back with what you think Africa is about and what you think the stories of the people are about?
What books are you currently reading? And also, are there any that stand out in terms of a narrative that we aren't normally familiar with, a book that takes a different spin on the African story?
Well, I suppose if it's books that we're currently reading, we will do like a shameless plug. So currently we are editing and completing our first anthology for Black History Month, which touches on different aspects of Black identity and African identity. Definitely worth reading. And it's actually going to be free for download via our website. The other book, which I'd highly recommend, is one called Nairobi Echoes by a gentleman from Kenya called Stanley Gazemba. I don't know if, Kuda, you have anything else to add to that.
Yeah, so at the moment, as Barbara's mentioned, I think one of the things that you find, I don't know if other publishers experience this, is the way it sort of like works between us is that sometimes Barbara sort of like deals with different authors to the authors that I sort of like speak to. So you find that maybe a book is released, but you don't necessarily always get the opportunity immediately to actually read it once it's actually finished and gone through the editing process. So at the moment, I'm actually going through another one of our books as well. It's called Side Babies, and it was written by Zainab Omaki. She is originally from Nigeria, and she basically writes about stories about contemporary African women that are based in Nigeria and sort of like their different experiences with love, and just various things that sort of like take place in their lives, marriage, etc., etc. So, yeah. But there are other books, of course, that we do read beyond sort of like the ones that are written by our authors.
Right. Now, one of the challenges very many people have when starting a business is coming up with a name for their company. So, Bahati Books, what does Bahati mean, and why the elephant on your logo?
Okay, so Bahati actually means lucky in Swahili. We literally came up with this book sort of like based on what we've already mentioned, it was more so to do with the whole thing about finding titles. So each time you would speak to someone who essentially either knows about a different book or knows about a different author, for instance, it was almost like Chinese whispers for us. So every time you'd find out about a new book or a new author, you felt sort of like lucky for both myself and Barbara. So we thought, you know what, actually, because of that, we will actually call, Bahati Books.
Right, that's an interesting story. And as a business itself, how does Bahati Books make money? What do the revenue streams look like?
Okay, so in terms of how it makes money, it's quite a straightforward model. So it's a B2C model, meaning business to customer. We make money based on the number of ebooks we sell. Slightly complicated by the fact that we sell it through a third-party platform. So Amazon, Kobo, and so on. We don't sell it directly from our website, but it's pretty straightforward. So people purchase the book, and then based on the sales, we, make the profit.
Right. And what does the process look like if, say, I'm an author, I've got a book that I want to release and I want to partner with you? What steps do I take to make sure my book gets to Bahati Books?
Yeah, so in terms of our steps, really, it's quite straightforward, because I think one of the things that makes Bahati Books quite unique and different from other publishers is that when you want to approach other publishers, generally you would need an agent to be able to even get access to them. But for us, we actually like authors to come directly to us. So if you, for instance, had a book that you wanted to be published via Bahati Books, all you need to do really is just to send it to us directly, and you either speak to either myself or Barbara. So what we always try and do is to establish that relationship with people from the very get-go, because we believe in building a relationship with our authors and, ensuring that the process itself is quite smooth. So once we essentially get a manuscript, we go through it and we'll either tell you, if it's generally, we want it to be quite well edited and very well written and quite strong, because obviously it's important to have content that people are actually going to enjoy and people want to actually buy your book, essentially. And so once we sort of read the book, we'll either tell you, if it's a great book, we'll tell you, what, we love your manuscript, and essentially send out the contract to them, and we can just start talking from there. And once the negotiations are sort of done with the contracts, then some contracts are signed, and literally that's it.
Right. Okay, that sounds very straightforward, actually. And well, this is a question that I will struggle with. Very many entrepreneurs have this challenge. Perhaps they have a full-time job, or maybe they don't, and then they start a business. But one thing many people fail to factor in is that as you're starting your business and building it, it may not necessarily make money right away. So there'll be a period there where you have to basically go through the grind without necessarily seeing any profit. So from your experience, how did you go through that, can I say, that rough patch? Or how are you finding alternative revenue sources to, push you through this rough patch? And if you have found any solution, what can you advise people that are maybe planning to get into a business, but they know for sure that it might not necessarily bring the return immediately?
In terms of going through the rough patch, how we dealt with it was that we started Bahati Books when we were still in full-time jobs. And we stayed in those full-time jobs for about 6 months. And so throughout, and that obviously was the really early startup time. And so firstly, definitely it is worth having income where you can then pump it into the business. But inevitably, once your business is kind of starting to look after itself, it becomes a bit more challenging if you have a full-time job and you're trying to juggle it with growing a business. So we reached that kind of stage at the start of this year where we thought, okay, our business is starting to get legs and starting to, show a lot of promise. So it then became difficult to take advantage of all the different opportunities when Monday to Friday, you're fully occupied in a job which requires you to physically be there, yet you're missing meetings which are related to your business. So as of the start of this year, we went full time. And I would also recommend, if you are considering kind of going full time, definitely having a savings nest whereby you in addition to funding your business, you also have some money set aside to look after your daily expenses when you do decide to eventually leave. And obviously that looks different for everybody. And there's some people who grow very successful enterprises when they're still in their full-time jobs. It's just, in our case, we felt the need to go full-time on Bahati Books, but definitely going through the rough patch, I would always recommend. Usually most people tend to have full-time jobs because that helps pay the bills, and also, it keeps the business cash rich, but also having and building a savings nest for yourself for the day, perhaps, when you do decide to go out on your own.
Yeah. And what I would also recommend as well is, even sometimes for a lot of people, what I would probably advise is, when you sort of go out and you are doing something maybe full time, and you start to feel like maybe you are going maybe through a rough patch, because the truth is eventually savings do run out for anyone. And what I would suggest is that if you use your talents and use your skills, essentially. So if you're a person, let's just say, for instance, who's good at doing hair, I would suggest that maybe, once or twice a week or something along those lines, try and get people to actually do their hair, so that you sort of like keep that income for yourself, because it's important to also show that other side of entrepreneurship, which I think a lot of people don't necessarily talk about, to sort of like say, look, even if sometimes, like I said, that your savings either run out or things are a little bit rough and you maybe need to do something extra to actually make that extra bit of money before your business actually starts working for itself, sort of thing. It's important as well to, use your skills. If you're a person who, is good at writing, maybe you can consider freelancing for a particular, magazine, for instance, and maybe getting a little bit of money from that. So trying to get as much money as possible in the best way possible for you, but obviously not forgetting that the most important thing throughout the process is you establishing yourself within your business and establishing your business to work for itself.
Right. Now, both of you have actually seen either side of the coin. And by that, I mean, you've been employed full time and you've owned your own business. So can you just share with us what opportunity, for instance, Bahati Books has presented you that you probably wouldn't have gotten had you remained in full-time employment?
That's a good question. So in terms of the opportunities that Bahati Books has given us, speaking from my perspective as Barbara, definitely the skill set that you need to develop at running a startup is completely different to, well, not entirely different, but largely different to running a business that's already functioning. So in my previous role as a journalist, I worked for a company that had been around for 100 years. They already have the momentum, the customer base, they have, the networks and so on. So really all you become is a cog in the wider kind of machine, right? You come in and then just do what you're told to do, because that just keeps the machine going. But with a startup, you constantly need to create momentum. And so for me, it's given me a massive skill set in terms of just starting something and creating momentum every single day and, building something essentially from nothing. So, and that's what entrepreneurship is, just the value and the skill set to build something from nothing and then hopefully one day selling it for quite a lot of money. So from my perspective, I think the one thing which I would have never gotten from a job is that ability to just, build and to build really from the ground up rather than, be a housekeeper in a machine that's functioning perfectly.
Yeah. And for myself, I think there's so much that I could possibly actually say, but just to name a few things. So I think one of the things that I learned personally is the power in networking. And I remember when I was still working on my full-time job, networking was never something that I used to think about. It never occurred to me what could possibly come out from simply either going to events where there's like-minded people or going to places essentially where you wouldn't normally go to anyway. But it's opened up so many doors in terms of where Bahati's, momentum, as Barbara has mentioned, because a lot of the things that we've managed to do, it's really through the power of networking. And also then learning actually how to speak to people, building relations with people is something that I myself have really had to learn to do, sort of thing, going forward. And another thing as well, which Barbara sort of like touched upon, is, having discipline as a person, because I think a lot of times, you can learn maybe a few skills about the business, but I think there's a lot of personal skills as well, and personal things that you learn even about yourself as a person, so learning to know what your strengths and your weaknesses are and learning on how you can be able to play on both. So even if you've got a strength, sometimes your strength can actually work against you in certain moments. And so it's about knowing how to maybe harness that yourself, and also being able to sort of like, your weakness, you start to realize and see your weaknesses, and being able to either work on them to become better at it, or seeing how you can still work your way to not even necessarily make it better, but certain things maybe you can't necessarily change them immediately, but seeing on how you can still utilize that weakness in order for you to move forward.
Right. And from my perspective, one of the things that I've personally picked up is how to basically have some self-discipline, because, when you have your own business, you have all the time in the world and nobody can tell you when to start and when to finish. So that ability to make use of the time you have and put it to the most is something that you learn and develop as you go along.
No, definitely. I agree with you 100%, because I think for a lot of entrepreneurs, like you're saying, you think that now that, you've got this business, you can just wake up at whatever time. But in actual fact, if you want it to actually work, you probably have to wake up actually 3, 4, 5 hours, before normal people that go on their 9 to 5, because as Barbara's mentioned, the difference with, working a 9 to 5 is that you're going to work for this bigger machine, which you're just contributing, maybe 20% of your energy, because maybe there's other people as well that are contributing. But when it comes to your own business, it's 100%. There isn't any room to sort of like say, oh, I'll do this later, or oh, I'll wait for. There's no one else that's going to do it. Everything is waiting for you to be able to step in and do it, because if you don't do it, no one's going to do it.
And also, the reward isn't guaranteed, because you see, if you have a job, well, your salary will come in regardless. But if it's your own enterprise, you must make it work to reap from it, basically.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And I suppose that's when you sort of like start to think of, people that we admire, that have made it really, you start to sort of like realize that, of course, people, we only see the results of it at the end of the day, but those people certainly had to really work hard in order for them to reap the results, for them to be where they are today. And it definitely came from that discipline that, like you're saying, and just making sure you're giving it 100% and working to essentially get that money.
Here's a question I have for you. It's when those people you mentioned, the people we look up to, they seem to have a hunger that, that they can never satisfy, because no matter how popular or how much success they garner, they just seem to be able to go at it with the same aggressiveness. So how do you, as Bahati Books, maintain that, can I say, desire to keep going? Because sometimes we have some low days where we just not feeling it. You wonder, really, is this worth it, all this hustle? But how do you motivate yourself to keep going and chasing the prize?
In terms of motivation, I think it's always important to just have a larger reason. And so for me in particular, I just think the one thing that keeps on cropping up into my mind is that there's always this negative image of the continent that I come from. And there's not enough people who purposefully want to change that. So that yesterday I went to watch this excellent film called Doctor Strange. But I remember when they were talking, they said, oh, we have portals to every single part of the world, London for Europe, Hong Kong for Asia, New York for the Americas. And then they carried on. And I was like, wait, but hold on, is Africa not part of the world? So where's that gateway? And it's just, for me, that's always part of the bigger why. So hopefully in our own way with Bahati Books, we're changing that, and we're changing this kind of very narrow-minded view that's still held in, dominant media about, inverted commas, Africa, and just kind of diversifying that. And, so for me, it's constantly kind of remembering, okay, why are you doing this? Always remember, the bigger picture. It's bigger than just me alone. It's kind of changing those perceptions as well.
Yeah. And I suppose another motivation would be our authors, because essentially one of the main reasons, which is the why, as Barbara said, it's about giving an opportunity to voices that are not usually heard. And when you read some of these manuscripts, you sit there and you think, this is absolutely amazing. How is it possible that this person hasn't, been published? Why hasn't this person been talked about, And that then pushes you to sort of like say, you know what, this has to be out. This person deserves to be heard. This story deserves to be heard. And that then in itself then becomes your motivation, to ensure that you do as best as you can to make sure that the people that you are representing that have entrusted you with their work, you're able to give it 100% of what it really truly deserves. Because like we said, one of our key message tagline is that, your story matters, and that's what's important to us to say. Each story that we put out, it's because it matters. It needs to be heard. It has to be heard, and it needs to be shared with the world.
Bahati Books only does digital copies. Why is that?
A few reasons. So at first, it was because of just the sheer cost of publishing, so physical copies. The reason why only a few publishers tend to be in that physical hard print space is because publishing hard copies can be quite expensive, and in addition, the distribution costs and the cost of stocking them in big retailers and so on, that adds, and the cost of shipping if you want to then ship out to other parts and other territories in the world. So at first it was kind of pragmatic. We thought, we want to start kind of this online platform where people can publish, and let's just do it in a really accessible way. But then the more we did it, the more we actually realized that the digital space is actually, there's so much innovation happening at the moment, and it's still pretty kind of early on in the curve. But at the moment, there's so much happening in the digital space beyond just, Kindles and tablets and so on. There's innovations at the moment where people are developing technology and software where, people can interactively change stories as they go along. And it's just the more we've been engaged in the side of trade and commerce and, reading, the more we've realized that this industry is one that's having a massive explosion in innovation. And actually for us, it's now become much more strategic as a space to get involved in.
Yeah, I suppose another reason, Barbara's mostly touched upon it, but, one of the things as well, which you realize is that when you look at how consumer behavior is actually happening at the moment, it's changed a lot. So when you think about the internet, it's becoming quite pervasive in terms of like in all areas of people's lives. So when you think about mobile phones or tablets or any sort of like reading environments, a lot of them are already playing an important role in how people experience reading, and more importantly, in terms of like how people actually discover and sort of like purchase and consume content. Because when you look at the way people nowadays even read newspapers, people hardly ever sort of like go for the hard copy. First thing you wake up in the morning, you usually look at your mobile phone, don't you, and say, I wonder what the news is saying. You don't look to say, oh yeah, I need to get, X amount so that I can pass through the shop to buy a newspaper. So reading behaviors essentially are changing, and most people are now reading online. And so, as Barbara's mentioned, it's also about placing yourself in a strategic way, because that's where things are going. Essentially, it may not necessarily be at a rapid rate, but things are slowly, changing in some sort of like sectors. For instance, newspapers and magazines, it's more rapid. It's more or less taken over, and most people read online. But in terms of reading as well for literature, more and more people are finding that, when they're on their train or on their way to work or anything, it's usually trying to read either a story online or something along those lines, as opposed to sort of like buying a book. And the advantage of also having to have mobile tablets or anything along those lines, it's that you're able to have 100 books on one device, which you can't necessarily carry 100 books in your bag, but you have that ability to either change. If you're not interested in this book, you can immediately change and get another book, and it's that ability to be able to just have a lot of things, but in just one light device.
Right. Now, you ladies have obviously read so many African books. So if you were to see one of those African books on the big screen, basically turned into a movie, what African book would you like to see?
Oh, I think for me, it has to be, I'd love to see The Spider King's Daughter by Chibundu Onuzo.
What's it about?
So The Spider King's Daughter, essentially, it's a love story, essentially between a boy and a girl, but they live in two different worlds. So the girl, in actual fact, comes from a very wealthy, rich family, and she essentially falls in love with this hawker on the street. And so it sort of like talks about how their relationship develops, but it's in sort of like the voice of the young man and the voice of the girl. But it's the way it's written. As I was reading it, I remember thinking this would be amazing, because you know when you're reading books and you can picture, because generally when I'm reading books, in actual fact, I usually play it as a movie. And for me, that book, it just worked perfectly for a movie. So definitely it's one of the many books that I would love to see on the screen.
I just remembered one book which I actually really enjoyed, just by chance, actually. So it's, God, I think I'm getting the author's name wrong. I think she's called Abiola Awonubi. But her book is called I Do Not Come to You by Chance. And I actually really enjoyed it because it's a book that kind of makes the villain almost a hero. So essentially what the storyline is it's about this Nigerian guy who's unable to find employment. So he has all these, qualifications and degrees and so on, but he can't find employment. But then one of his uncles, who's doing really well, tells him, okay, if you need some help, this is not necessarily legal, but I can help you kind of, all you need to do is just send a bunch of fake emails saying that you're this guy who's lost all these millions, and whoever responds to your email, then obviously build a relationship with them, the 419 thing. And we all have obviously this idea of 419 criminals. We think, oh, they're these, unruly people who sit behind a computer screen in Nigeria and they just want to steal your money. But actually the guy who's the protagonist in this book, who then obviously gets sucked into that world, and it talks about all the circumstances that lead him to get sucked into this world. Obviously, he's growing up in a country which, even if he tries to get the right degrees, he tries to do all the good things, the corruption in the system is so much against him that he has no choice but to get into this trade. And he becomes the anti-hero because you kind of want to root for him. And so I remember reading it and kind of being really surprised at how much I enjoyed it. And so I think it'd be quite interesting to kind of see that anti-hero type of film. I just feel sometimes when it comes to film and portraying African characters, it's currently really saturated with either slave stories or right now, I know Queen of Katwe came out, and I do like Lupita, but I think she plays a lot of subservient roles, and it's kind of about this really, poor kid in Uganda who plays chess and whatever. But it'd be interesting to see kind of slightly more complex narratives turned into films, something like that.
Well, that's interesting. And the final question is, if you were cast away to a desert island and you could only take one of each, what book would you take with you? What movie would you take with you? And what song would you take with you?
Oh, you can take that first, Kuda.
I knew you were going to throw that one here. Right. So, okay. So what book would I take with me? I'm going to go with this book called Africa 39, which was written by, it was basically put together. So it's a collection of short stories, which was put together by Hay Festival. I would essentially take that simply because it's a collection of short stories and there's 39 stories. So I wouldn't get bored with literally reading one storyline. I would have a mixture of all sorts of stories from different parts of the continent, which is really great. And what was the other one? The movie which I'll take. Okay, I would probably go with. Okay, is it one or two? Can I go with one movie or two?
You can do two, no problem.
I can do two. Okay, I'm gonna go with one of my all-time favorites, and please do not judge me on this. I'll take King Kong. But King Kong...
Which one? There's like different versions
There's
of King Kong.
There's different versions. It's the last version that was made, I believe, around 2001, 2002. Yes, that is the movie that I would take. Simply because, like I said, I am a massive fan of King Kong. Always have been for some reason, since I was young. And I love the last one. I think they did that one much better than the older ones. I think the older ones, they look a little bit ridiculous when you look at King Kong. But I'll definitely take that one. A song that I would have to take, I am going to go for a classic one. that, okay, a classic boy group, which I absolutely love. I'm going to go for Boys to Men. Yeah, Boys to Men.
Yeah, I was going to say exactly the same for song, actually. I was going to say any Boys to Men song, I'd be happy.
Exactly. I have to go with something whereby I don't think there's a Boys to Men song that they released which I ever thought, I don't like this. Every single song. So it has to be a Boys to Men song.
Barbara, what about yourself, the book and movie?
Okay, so obviously song, it will be any Boys to Men song. Book, one of my favorite books ever is The Alchemist by Paulo Coelho. So I'd take that one. I think I've read it, 3 times or 4 times. So that's just one of those books that I can read every single time and learn something new. Film, I really like the film style of early 90s kind of New Jack / hip hop era. And my favorite film to come out of that era is called New Jack City. It starred Wesley Snipes in it. And I just love that film. I think I've watched it 3 times. So I'll take that film. Right.
Well, lastly, how can people get in touch with you and Bahati Books on your website, social media, or email?
info@bahatibooks.com. That's our email address. Definitely they can feel free to drop us a line. If it's submissions, please check on our website. We have submission guidelines, but as Kudakwashe mentioned earlier, you don't need to get an agent, but do please try and follow some of our guidelines on our website. And also we're on social media. So on Facebook, Instagram and Twitter, just type in Bahati Books and please follow us, and also give us a shout out if you listen to this podcast.
Okay, and the other social media network we're actually on is YouTube. So just to add, so we've literally just recently started what we've called Stories in Motion. So talking about, what you mentioned about, bringing books to life. One of the things that we are doing is sort of talking about our authors and actually bringing our authors to life and bringing them face to face with their audience, because I think a lot of times what readers tend to find is that when it comes to books, you always want to know who the person is behind the book. So one of the things that we're doing is we've just started sort of a short video series. There's sort of short sound bites that we do. And so we essentially have a YouTube channel, and it's also called Bahati Books. So they can essentially have a look at that. And also if they go on a social media as well, there are a few videos that we've already done, so they can check those out.
Right. Well, that's very good. And thank you so much for joining us today on Business Mike. We certainly wish you the very best in all your endeavors with Bahati Books.
Thank you
so much, Daudi.
Thanks for listening to the Business Mike podcast. I hope you enjoyed the show. If you'd like to listen to more episodes just like this one, simply go to businessmike.com. I would love to hear from you. So if you've got any questions or feedback, you can reach me on Twitter @Daudi Mugabe, on Facebook @Business Mike, or email. That's daudi@businessmike.com. Don't forget, we have a brand new episode every Monday. And until then, take care.